This is Friday, March 13th, 2009. We're in the Ray Nicholson House at the University of Georgia. This is Tom Jackson, and we're interviewing William A. Bill Simpson, who is a 1950 graduate of the university's College of Journalism and served as public relations director from 1956 to 1970.
Right.
Okay, I've got those years right.
Right.
Welcome, Bill. We're glad to have you with us today.
Thank you.
Let's start at the beginning, because we're going to talk a lot about the University of Georgia, but I understand the beginning was in North Carolina.
Right.
You grew up there?
I was born in Greenville, North Carolina, the home of now East Carolina University. When I lived there, it was a small tobacco town, and that was called East Carolina Teachers College, with one of the great nicknames, I guess, of all times to me, ECTC. I just love it. It rolls off. And now it's East Carolina University. I moved to Athens when I was 12. My dad was transferred here in late 41. My mother and I moved in early 42 and went to what was then junior high, Athens High School, and then a university.
So the university was a natural for you?
No question about it.
How did you decide to go to the University of Georgia?
Well, I was always interested in newspapers. My dad's office was next to the local newspaper office, and I became acquainted with it at early age. And when I was 7 years old, I launched a little kid's one-page local newspaper, and I thought it would last. I went around and got subscriptions, 5 cents each for a week, once every day. And eventually these fade out, but mine lasted, and eventually I had about 150 people in town paying a penny each for the newspaper, and it started out daily, went to 3 days, then it got down to 1 week, and when I finally wanted to play baseball more than I did do that, gave it up, but it lasted 3 or 4 years. So when I came to Athens, my family for a couple of years actually lived in the Holman Hotel, which is the bank building downtown now. And I did a little newspaper for the Boy Scout troop I was in, and I also worked for the Banner Herald. Would go down when I was like, I don't know, 15 years old, 14, 15 years, I'd go to the Banner Herald. It goes to show you what state they were in, but on Saturday nights, I would go to the Banner Herald and do proofreading and write headlines, and they usually had a university student who was the mainspring there doing it. I became acquainted with some of the journalism people and was very interested in that. I would add that the finances dictated the choice of the university as well. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it was unnatural.
Well, I was digging through an old file and found a reference to you as the youngest newspaper editor in the country.
That's what the Associated Press, I think it was, didn't have much to write about in the 30s and the Depression. That was good, and so they picked that idea up and came around, did a story, and it was fascinating. I got letters from everybody from the White House to the governor, and one of the best was from a guy in the state of Oregon who had started the first newspaper in the state of Oregon and maintained a correspondence. It was great fun, and it unfortunately reflected my life's business acumen because I had it backward from the very beginning. I sold the newspaper, subscriptions, but I gave the ads away. That's my business sense is exemplified by that for the rest of my life.
Well, with that background, I guess the College of Journalism was no question.
It was, I was looking forward to it, and I'm very proud of that.
Well, when you first set foot into the Grady College, what were your impressions of the place? What are some of the people you remember? What were the facilities, that sort of thing?
Well, I was familiar with the place and some of the people before I got there. I was active in the high school association that the state had and knew some of them. And there was a journalism professor who lived in the hotel when my family lived in the hotel here. So I knew some of those, and I knew Dean Drury. I was not very worldly, so it seemed like the great place to me.
And y'all were in the old CJ building?
Yes.
Which is now Brook Hall?
Yes.
Tell us about how it was at the time.
Well, again, if you haven't been exposed to things elsewhere, you feel comfortable where you are, I think. And I remember the murals, the Charlotte murals in there, which always were impressive sight. And facilities as I moved up the line in terms of student status seemed to have some limitations, but they were most adequate for what we did. And I debated which course to follow in journalism school, and ended up in what was, you only had 2 or 3 choices. I ended up in radio, because television was not there. And the radio facilities were extremely limited, one little studio. And I don't know that I was overwhelmed by the instruction. But one of the instructors, who later became a very good friend and who passed away sadly about a year ago, was Worth McDougall. And I remember Worth very well from his first days. He was a delightful instructor.
At that time, he would have been on the ground floor of the Peabody Awards as well. They were just getting underway. Do you recall any involvement in that?
I don't recall any involvement in it. I do remember the Peabody Awards. That was one of the distinguishing things of the school. Was, and Dean Drury did have extraordinary lines out, here and there. He's quite a character.
Do you recall a typical day as a UGA student? What would your day have been like?
Well, I know I didn't study as well as I should have. I was a straight A student in high school, commencement speaker, all of those things. And some years ago, I came across a transcript from my university days, and I was shocked. I really thought I'd done better than that.
You apparently enjoyed your time.
I did. I had a good time. And among other things, as a journalism student, I wanted to work on the red and black, and in those days there was a real competitive spirit between the fraternity groups and the so-called independents. It was politically competitive and everything, and I tried to work on the red and black and kept getting shunted into the corner because I happened to be in a fraternity at that time. And after a while, I said, I don't need this. I can go back and work on the newspaper. And so I chose some other cases. I regret that I never did work on the red and black. But I did work on a magazine called the Georgia Cracker, which was here at that time. Did some work for the Banner Herald. And the Atlanta newspapers in the 40s did not have the staffs they have now, though today, because of the circumstances, back to where it was then. But and they didn't have the wherewithal to do everything they do now, both electronically and otherwise. So what the sports department did in those days is they had a stringer or correspondence for the Journal Sports or for the Constitution Sports. So I got the job as I'd been a manager of the baseball team for the first couple of years I was here. Wanted to play baseball, but I didn't have that talent, so I managed the team for a couple of years. And I think that was a springboard. I got a job with the Atlanta Journal as their stringer, and filed a story every day. Go down to the local Western Union office at night, sit there at their typewriter, and send it off night press rate collect to the Journal. And there was another guy who did the Constitution the same way. So my time was occupied, and I had a good time. I enjoyed being a student.
Interestingly enough, I did that for the Constitution 30 years later as a stringer covering Athens. Right. What was the social life then? You said I think you were a Sigma Chi?
I was.
I
am. We like to say I am.
You are?
Yes.
Did you enjoy your fraternity time? What do you remember of that?
I enjoyed it very much.
Were most people at the university in fraternities at the time?
I don't think so, and I have no idea what the percentage is now. But if I had to guess, I would say that it was certainly not a majority of students, but it was a pretty sizable contingent. And the thing about college life to me is that I came in '46, and the fall of '46, and excuse me, I made a note of this because I couldn't remember exactly what it was, but in 1946, the enrollment was 6,643 students. Of those, 4,000 were veterans. Mm-hmm. So the rest of us were 16, 17-year-olds innocents, but made some lifetime friends among both groups, veterans who've been away. And interestingly enough, I don't recall the veterans ever sitting down and talking about their wartime experiences. It wasn't done. And of course, I finished in 1950 and got a degree and an ROTC commission the same time. Headed off for California to seek my fame and fortune, and immediately the Korean War broke out. So I came back from out there. But and my friends of that era, the Korean War era, you just don't hear people talking about it. Nowadays, you hear people have begun to elicit conversation out of veterans. Mm-hmm. And the PBS series on World War II a year or so ago really, really got to me. I watched the entire thing, and I sat there with tears in my eyes a lot of nights. And the result was that I got copies of the DVDs and gave them to my children and begged them to look at it, mm-hmm. because I realized that of all these people, I had never really consciously said to these people, thank you for saving all of us, mm-hmm. for saving all of us.
You spoke about the juxtaposition of those hardened veterans with the green young people. How did that socially interact?
And I'm sure there might have been some differences, but I'm not conscious of them. But
you made friends in the veterans group?
Yeah, there was no difference. I mean, you made friends with whomever you would make friends with, and they were very social. They were active. They obviously were more mature than most of us, and that would be the regret I have that at 16, I turned 17 shortly after I got in college, but very immature, and I think that was a difference between the two.
You remember your commencement day?
A little bit, yeah. I remember some of it. It was the largest graduating class at that time in the history of the university, somewhere like 1,500 or so.
And this was spring of 1950?
1950. Mm-hmm. And I had thought that I knew a lot of people on the university campus until I showed up at the graduation. I looked around. Now, who are these people?
That happens today.
I guess it does.
And then you said you went to California after graduation?
Yes, I had. Laughingly, I guess, I had composed a lot of music, which, and I'd say laughingly because by today's standards it would be laughingly, but it was the old Tin Pan Alley sort of things. I'd helped stage a number of variety shows and things of this nature, like the Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney, let's do a show type of thing for schools and other groups, and I just thought maybe I could peddle some of my 32-bar songs out there. Learned quickly when I got out there that I really didn't know anything about that. But the war probably saved Hollywood from my so-called talents. But I came back because before I left here, in all innocence, I had given my name to a group that wanted to start a new reserve military unit here. And I got the word that either I would be called individually or collectively, and I decided I'd better go collectively. And I came back, and the units were never called, though they were always on alert, which left me to hunt a job and do for until I did get called. And I really don't know how this happened, because I'm sure somebody at the university had to approve it. But in the fall of 1950, coming back sitting with a Army Infantry Commission, and waiting for the call, and nobody would hire. I guess the laws today perhaps make it better for people in that category, but that time no one would hire you in that thing. So I said, well, I want to go back to school, and they let me come back, I guess, because I went back to the university and took several courses that I always wanted to take, that I had not had a chance to take as an undergraduate. And I wasn't working toward a degree. They just knew I was doing this, but I did that. And then I got a job at the radio station broadcasting sports, play-by-play sports for the old Athens High School sports, football, basketball.
Which station was that?
That's WRFC, which was relatively new. And one of my companions was one of your later bosses, H. Randolph-Holer, who was one of the really fine persons I've ever known.
Yes, he was.
So I did those sports, and I did Georgia sports. I was the first person who ever did Georgia basketball total schedule at home, broadcast baseball, and some of those things you read about now, where Georgia baseball and they didn't want to pay the money to go, for instance, to Kentucky, so they hook it up with a Western Union operator in Lexington, and he's sending this little tape that comes off like the movies, and it says, Tom Jackson at bat, strike one, ball one, and you're sitting here in a studio reading this and recreating a ball game as if you're watching the ball game, which was sort of fun, really. And you had a little gadget here, that would make it sound like the ball was hitting a bat, and the crowd noise, and control the whole thing. And I never will forget, after that game the next day, I ran to somebody on the street and said, that was a great game in Lexington. I said, it was a great game. They said, man, that guy that hit that home run, he said, I thought that ball was never coming down. I said, well, I probably left it in the air too long.
Well, if you were doing basketball in those days, I guess you would have been in old Woodruff Hall.
Woodruff Hall.
Tell us about Woodruff Hall and doing basketball live from there.
Well, Woodruff Hall, as you have heard,
stood on the site of the current journalism college.
That's correct. There were some tennis courts there. The university's first tennis courts were there, right next to that, and the Woodruff Hall. And Woodruff Hall, when it was built, was really one of the fine basketball arenas in the South, and named for the Woodruff family, who had played an integral part in both the university's days in the 20th century and athletics too. And from the standpoint of a basketball arena, when I was in high school and played basketball during World War II, we didn't have money to go anywhere. We played, and only you who are familiar with Athens would know this, but we played Coma, Colbert, Watkinsville, Winterville. We played in gymnasiums that had potbelly stoves in the corner. You didn't want to get the ball out of bounds there too often. So Woodruff Hall was not a terrible thing to us, but as time went by, it became very obvious that it had great limitations. And if you remember, Red Lawson, who coached basketball for a long time, was famous for saying it was the only gymnasium in the country where wind was a factor. And I was a part of the university when we were trying to get the Coliseum. And I remember that I was with the then Lieutenant Governor of the state. We were in Dallas, Texas, and went out to look at some of the major arenas in Dallas at that time. We got the Coliseum at the university, incidentally, and I'm sure you're aware of this, that primarily because of the agricultural interests of the state. No way were we going to get a Coliseum based on athletics. So the athletic enterprise was an integral part of convincing the legislature, and Governor Vanderbilt was the one who made some money available. But interestingly enough, because of the unique construction of the Coliseum, one of the first game was Georgia Tech. Had the biggest crowd they ever had there, and they subsequently said you can't have that bigger crowd again. But one of the very early games, the roof started leaking on the basketball arena, and they had running around with buckets and claws and all this sort of thing. So it was ironic, I think, that we moved out of Woodruff to avoid that and moved into Coliseum. But, okay. Anyhow.
You were, so at some point in 1956, you became Director of Public Relations. Was that your title?
That's correct.
How did that come to pass?
Well, I had left the radio, and after the Korean War, I went to Atlanta, and I was the public relations person for the old CNS banks for the entire state. Great experience, and the head of the bank, Mills Lane, was a remarkable individual who was an extraordinary leader in banking, innovative, and I attribute much of my public relations philosophy to learning from him. Sadly enough, Georgia banking laws did not permit Georgia banks to grow to the point that they could avoid being absorbed in more recent years by North Carolina banks and some of the problems that have followed. But CNS banks at that time were the largest bank in the Southeast, and it was great to move around the state and to work with those people. I left that job after several years to become the national advertising manager for a packaging firm. And I heard about the public relations job here, and Dr. Adderhole, who was president at that time, actually interviewed me for the job in the lobby of a hotel, Dinkel Plaza, one of the old historic hotels in Atlanta. On a Saturday morning, he said, "I'll be over there, I want to talk to you." And I really was not, I had no thought of coming back to Athens, or certainly coming with the university, but among other things, and it almost touched an idealistic nerve, I guess, because I remember distinctly what really got to me was that he says, "We need somebody to help us convince the people of Georgia to support education better, particularly higher education, and more particularly the University of Georgia. And we really need help in getting around the state and doing this." And, I guess I thought maybe I was the one that could do that. But I came over and started working. Yep. Mm-hmm. That's what it was.
Now, did you have a staff at the time, or were you?
Well, the public relations and historically, Dean Drury, in about 1925, according to history, was one of the first that suggested the university should do some public relations work and should set up some sort of program. They didn't want to use, and the records of this indicate they didn't want to use the word publicity, which they assumed was sort of a nasty word. I don't know historically what happened between 25 and the 50s. To the best of my knowledge, the first director of public relations was a gentleman named Dia Massey, who was an Athens man who had been, I think, at Furman, but who was brought in to head up the sesquicentennial observance in 1951. And he was here in 1950 because I was involved in a couple of university service programs that were asked to sort of help plan for that. I don't remember much that was done for that because funds were limited. But Dia was here, and Dia left to go somewhere else. And Louis Griffith, who had been a journalism professor and who had done some writing for Dr. Adderhole as president. Dr. Adderhole worked with a gentleman named Joe Williams, who later was dean of education and at one time dean of students, it was called. Had put together what's called the Minimum Foundation for Georgia, which is one of the first real efforts to enhance the funding of higher education and education in all phases in the state of Georgia. So Louis was made the director of public relations, and then he was subsequently named the assistant to Dr. Adderhole, and that's when the job came open. But under the structure, the public relations office included the news bureau, which had its own director and one staff person at that time. Later added another staff person. So in terms of public relations staff per se, no, it was a one-person thing, but it was really not a one-person operation.
Mm-hmm. What were the main functions of the office at that time? You traveled the state pitching education and...
Well, to some extent, you made your own job. Mm-hmm. The news bureau was the news operation, and it was limited by funding and other things. Over the several years, I accepted any and every invitation to go anywhere in the state of Georgia, some by plan, some by just waiting for it to happen. But I was on, for years, I either provided the program, I was on a program, or emceed a program, or some phase of being out there up to 200 times a year. And we put together different things. For instance, wanted to do we weren't reaching the broadcast people, and I had a broadcast background, so we started a regular weekly broadcast to provide to radio stations across the state of Georgia.
Was that University Almanac or its predecessor?
It's a predecessor. I don't remember the exact name of it. Yeah. We had a little. It started out a weekly little newsletter for the campus, which was a process of your fine publication columns now. Later on, I worked with community groups. I was very active in the community groups, and the funding funding in all respects was very meager for years. In my opinion, the best friend the University of Georgia has ever had in the governor's chair was Carl Sanders. And I also think he was the best governor in my lifetime. And when he became governor, he really was devoted to education. And he really began to build up support for education across the board, but university included. And we began to get some real funding in the mid-'60s, and the biggest funding the university had ever had came the year after he stepped down, when Lester Maddox came in. But no disrespect to Lester, but I think it was a result of what Carl had done. And in his 65 or 66, 67, when Fred Davison came in, we had the largest growth of faculty in the history of the university, other than when we went from one teacher to two.
Right.
We had 400 faculty, roughly, in the early 60s. And 67 added 300 and some odd faculty. It was a huge growth all at one time. I had suggested, with no success, several times that we needed some type of orientation for new faculty. Well, when you're only getting 1 or 2 a year, nobody feels that's necessary. But when we had this influx of faculty, it seemed to be rather important. And nobody really wanted to do that, so I did that. And I started a faculty orientation, which proved to be rather important. When President Davison took office, I met with him the first morning he was in office, and I told him what I thought might be done. I I had gone to Dr. Davison after he was named to be president. He was a vice chancellor at the university, and had told him that I thought that I'd waited for a change. I thought well of Dr. Adderhole, and as time goes by, I have thought more and more of Dr. Adderhole. I think he was a committed person to doing it, despite the integration problems and his involvement there. But I know he was committed to educating Georgia students in particular. But I told Dr. Davison, I said, it's really important. I think you got a great opportunity. And I've really been looking forward to this. But I've been thinking about it, and I've decided that if I truly believe that the president and the public relations officer ought to work hand in glove, I think you should have the right to name your own person. So I want to tell you that you're going to have it. I've got my resignation for you. And he persuaded me to stay, which, I decided to do. But I did meet with him the first day he was in office. And I said, hey, here's some things I think you might want to do. And I think they're waiting for you. I think the faculty is waiting for you. And I would suggest that next week you go to the faculty lounges, wherever they are, and sit down with them over coffee and say, I've been a dean, I've been vice chancellor, but I'm now president. I want to know what you think we need to do and what we ought not do. I said, I think you should go down go over to the dining hall and fall in line. Get you a tray, go through the line, find you a table where students will let you sit with them and sit down and introduce yourself and say, I'm new here. I want to know what you think we should do. What do you think we ought not to do? And I said, the Red and Black was a campus newspaper in those days. I said, I'll take you down there one night, and I think it'd be good if you drop in and you just say, I'm a new guy on the block. I never have known how you do this. I'd like for you to tell me I'd like to do this. And I respect his response, but he says, Bill, I don't have time to do that. I don't have time to do that. I got too many other things on my plate. Well, of course, that year was when we started having some student demonstrations and some problems on the campus that got magnified. And in the spring of that year, his assistant, who was then Boyd McCurda, later Dean of Arts and Sciences, later Commissioner of the Southeastern Conference, Boyd called me and he says, Bill, I want to tell you that Dr. Davison is doing what you suggested. I said, what is that? He says, well, he's invited some of the student leaders to have lunch with him over at Bolton Hall. And he's going to ask him for this. And I said, no. That's not the same thing. You're meeting on your ground now, and that's not the same. But anyhow, we had it was a great experience, and I enjoyed most of everything that was there.
Back on President Adderhole, I understand in the early days, your offices were on the third floor of Old College.
Yes.
And you were looking for more funding, or you needed more space, or you had some issue, and you invited the president up to your office.
Well, I had come from business and industry, and where I had been was not extravagantly decorated in any wise, but the Office for Public Relations on the third floor of Old College, my office had torn paper shades on the windows. I had a desk which was left over from the Brumbaugh study, which was several years before one of these massive studies, which was a really important step in the development of the university. I had a swivel chair, which was left over from the Navy pre-flight school days in World War II. One spring already had gone through the bottom, and the other one was coming up the top, so I sat. That may be one of my problems now, but had a wooden chair for the guests to sit in, a little small table for my typewriter, and bookshelves which were boards that had been nailed together for books. And about the third day that I was here, I had a call from the president's secretary, and she said, Dr. Adderhall wants to come. His office was on the first floor. He says, wants to come up and visit with you. And I said, wonderful. And I thought to myself, this is a great opportunity. He probably has never seen this before, and he will want to do something about this. He was a very taciturn gentleman, didn't say very much, very quiet. And he comes up, and we chat just a moment. I just wanted to come to welcome you again, tell you this one. And I'm waiting for him to look around. He looks around the building, he looks at this, that, and he goes over and looks out the window. And we face the library on that corner, the library and the Hurdy Drive part of it. And he looks out the window, and he looks at it very carefully. He turns around and he says, you have a wonderful view here. And I said, yes, sir. And with that, he was departed.
He was gone.
He was gone. The follow-up to that is that his own offices really were dungeon-like. And I told his secretary, Sybil Weldon, I said, this is terrible. I said, this is president of the University of Georgia. Why don't you all do something about these offices? And she said, oh, no, says Dr. Adderhall will not do anything about this office. Says, he is so eager to get funding for new classrooms or to improve other parts of the university that he fears that if he were to do anything with this office, that some legislators would see it or other people and would think he was wasting money here. Well, within about the first year, they did decide to do something about it. He had some old leather furniture in the waiting room. And it was cracked leather, but it was leather. And it was sofa and chairs. And Mrs. Weldon was active in the Town and Gown Players, early amateur drama group that's still here. She kept trying to get me to participate. And I did not wish to do that. And at this point later, she said, we're going to do something about this office. And I said, that's great. She said, and I'm the one that's going to decide where all this furniture goes. And I said, oh. And she said, would you like to have the sofa? And I said, oh, yeah, that'd be great. Well, we have a part waiting for you in this Town and Gown play. So my participation on the boards of serious drama resulted in at least a sofa for the office. Then they took the desk out, and I got a slightly less used desk. It took 4 people to haul it down the steps of Old College because it was falling apart. Well, and mine was not the only one there. I mean, this was just the state of the university in those days. We really very, very poor and struggling days. And it was interesting to see what's happened. It's even more interesting to see what's happened in more recent years.
I think that sofa was still in the PR office when I took over.
Probably.
Perhaps the most prominent event of your time as public relations director at UGA was the racial integration of the institution.
Right.
In January 1961. You're prominent in the newsreel films. When you see the crowd coming through the arch with Charlene Hunter and Hamilton Holmes, you're in the crowd. I can see you working with news media. Tell us about what it was like in those days dealing with that issue.
Well, I don't remember being prominent in those crowds because we really did not take as active a role initially as I'm sure we should have. Well, it was a very challenging time. It was a difficult time. It reflected the culture, the customs, and some of the eras of the day.
Was your office told to keep hands off?
The office, and I was not told to keep hands off in any way, but I was, for instance, the night of the riot, or the worst demonstration, I was asked to stay home that night to be on call, and I wasn't there for that. The president's office and the president's assistant were pretty active in that at that time. we did have this. We had no requirement for media people to check in with us, but initially, a large number of them did come by the news bureau, which was more directly involved, and the public relations office. We had, my memory is not that good, but and I don't have those records, but we had somewhere near 200 news media people come by our office to register, and it was a very challenging time, and I tried early on to get the president to meet with the news media people, most of whom were staying at, or at least operating from, the Holiday Inn, the original Holiday Inn, the first part of it, before they added on all the other parts. And I got the president to agree to go over there and visit with them. That was not a good experience, because all he gave them were no comments, no comments, no comments, no comments. So we didn't try to do that again. Mm-hmm. As the week progressed, it was, it went over a week's period of time, the main activity of this, where they were registered, admitted, and sent back, and back and forth. As the week went on, I would go to the Holiday Inn every night and sit down with as many as I could get together. I didn't succeed in doing very much. I suggested that they develop a pool, because if you read accounts of what's happened that week, and interestingly, Robert Pratt's book on the desegregation is an interesting book, but he does not mention anywhere in there, there's a casual reference to it, but he doesn't mention anywhere in there the day-by-day activity of the students moving around campus. It was an awesome thing, and those two students are remarkable individuals. But they, the reference in the media was always, there's a mob following the students around campus. Well, you take 200 media people surrounding two individuals, and you got something of a mob visually, at least, right there. Never any reference to that. So I had suggested to him, because we had no requirements of anything. Whether you follow this, you can go to this place, that place. It was brand new. You'd create your own rules as you go. But I suggested they do a pool. And of course, they would have nothing of that. Later on, after all of this happened, and I don't think that's a very proud chapter in the university's history, but I think there's some satisfaction in that, despite all that took place, there were, no fatalities, no serious injuries, other than psychologically, emotionally. But after this, I was contacted by a number of institutions who had not gone through integration and asked for my suggestions on how to deal with the media. I remember specifically Clemson, Georgia Tech, Auburn, Florida. Alabama had already gone through the early stages. They had some more. Mississippi, of course, followed up with some really terrible things. But I didn't talk to those people. But not that I think that I gave them the grail to operate with, but Clemson, Tech, Auburn, and Florida did not have any of those problems when they did it. And before they got to Clemson, the head of either the American Newspaper Association or the Newspaper Publishers Editors Association, somebody on that level came out with recommendations, and they said, we're creating our own mobs, which is what we noticed here, and said that we need to do what they've done on the space launches. We need to have a pool thing. So at least a little of that happened, but it was not a happy occasion.
You could not have been happy with the way the University of Georgia wound up portrayed in a national news
No
story.
way. No way. As a matter of fact, the night of the riot, and it was a riot at
Myers Hall.
Myers Hall, and it's, some of that has been attributed to the Georgia Tech basketball game in old Woodruff Hall, which ended in overtime with Tech winning. But the records all indicate that planning was going on before that riot took place. I do think the basketball game provided a spark to bring more people into it and do those sort of things. But that same night on the Huntley Brinkley television, which was the big TV news thing, they had applauded the University of Georgia and the University of Georgia students for conduct up to that point. And we'd had some demonstrations up to that point. I had a student wife as a secretary at that time, and she would tell me every morning what the students' word was passing around campus, and so we had indications of all of this. And the better side of that was that we worked on Saturdays in those days, and Saturday morning, the week had gone by. It seemed to be calming down, but Saturday morning she comes in and she says, "Well, there's some activities that are going to start up again next week." And I said, "Well, who seemed to be the instigators of this?" And she told me, and so I left the third floor and I went down and went into the president's office where he was sitting with the dean of students. And I said, don't breathe too easily, because the word is that some more things are going to happen. And they asked about it, and I said, well, the two individuals that I have heard about are at the such and such fraternity house. I'll never forget, Dr. Addo turned to Dean Williams and said, "Get Dean Tate." And Dean Tate rushed over, and within an hour and a half, those two students were packed and on the road back to their homes, and we didn't have any more, I'd hate to use the word serious, but serious instances after that.
Now, Dean Tate also waded in some later demonstrations that
Tate was
the Vietnam War demonstrations.
Yes, the demonstrations here were tied both to the war, but also to student regulations. And at that time, when we were doing away with, when colleges were doing away with the in loco parentis, and the late 67, 68, 69, in that area right through there. Dean Tate was a legend. He was truly a legend, and he developed his own legendary status. He was not unmindful of this. I happened to be on a panel for the Athens Historical Society recently that was devoted the program to Dean Tate, and some of these things were brought out. He was a real character, and he could defuse a lot of situations. He was not able to defuse the riot, though he made a valiant effort to do some of that at Myers Hall, and some of these demonstrations around the old academic building during the Vietnam War. But as I say, they set in academic building not for the Vietnam War, but they were trying to get rid of the regulations governing girls' attire, hours girls had to report back in, things of this nature, and it developed to the other things.
This was about 1968 or 69?
Somewhere in that area. But the point that you're talking about is, at one point they marched out to the Prince Avenue and were going to demand to see Fred Davidson, the president. And he was not there. He had moved away from the home. And So they said, well, we're just going to stay parked down in Prince Avenue, and the reports indicate as many as 4,000. Estimates of crowds fascinate me. I don't really think it was quite that many, but it was a large number of people, and they filled up a large part of Prince Avenue. And Dean Tate just sat down in the middle of the street with them. And somebody reached over and handed him some peace beads, and he had them around his neck. And somebody says, well, Dean said, we can tell you right now, we're going to be here till morning. And his famous remark was, we'll make mine 2 over light. and he was fascinating. Let me interject one thing about Dean Tate and my undergraduate days, because I used this at this recent program. In the fall of '46, when we had this rush of students, mainly veterans, 4,000 veterans plus a couple of thousand, non-veterans coming back. University was really not up to handling all of that. Had to bring in a lot of new teachers or part-time teachers. And they drafted Dean Tate, who had an English teaching background, to teach a beginning course in English. And I had the great good fortune to be in that class. And we learned very quickly, as someone knew about this, that if you asked Dean Tate about his track history or about his relatives in Tate, Georgia, that you didn't have to worry about much classroom activity. And so, as I remember, I don't ever remember parsing a sentence. I don't really. I'm sure we did some of that in this beginning class, but somebody would always raise their hand and start. Dean Tate would entertain us for an hour. And my favorite Dean Tate story, I know it's not important to what you're doing, but my favorite Dean Tate story was the one he told us. He said his mother lived in Tate, and she had a hired hand who was accused of stealing a hog. And she hired the finest lawyer that she knew up there to represent this person. And he got to the court, and the man was found not guilty. And at that point, he says, the man turned to the judge and says, does that mean I get to keep the hog? Well, so we enjoyed Dean Tate.
Bill, throughout your career, you've been prominently involved and active in the civic affairs of Athens. President of the Chamber of Commerce, President of the United Way, the Kiwanis Club, the Town and Gown Players, involved in the creation of the Classic Center. The list is a long list. The penchant for civic leadership probably grew out somewhat of your position with the university and the necessity for the involvement. What were Town and Gown relationships back in the early days relative to what they are today?
Well, historically, I guess there's always been some degree of I think tension is too strong a word, but for lack of anything else that comes to mind, I think, student life has always had a little different, put a little different atmosphere on a normal community, a typical community life. So you look through the history of the university and, you can find instances of student activity and faculty, of course, often come from different philosophical points than business people, et cetera. I know one of the first year I came back as in public relations capacity university, I just made the observation. I said it can't be done, but I think one of the most wonderful things that could ever happen would be if the business and professional people could spend a year on a college campus and the faculty and administration of the university could spend a year in the business professional world and understand each other a little better. But I never sensed that there was any great problems in town-gown relationships. Obviously, when you had the integration crisis because of the custom, the culture, the so-called legalities of things, there was a lot of tension there. And later, when the demonstrations began, there was a lot of conversation about the university and university life. And at that point, in the late 60s, I tried to get, I have a long list of failures, but I tried to get the top people to develop a community relations board or commission, a committee, or whatever you want to call it. And anytime I made that suggestion, somebody says, "You go do it." So I did it, and I set up a community relations board in the late '60s, which included persons I thought were representative of the business, industrial, professional life, including blacks as well as whites, women as well as men. I don't know how successful that was, but I never sensed that we had any. There's always a challenge between an institution that is so prominent in a community. You know that from your experience that we outweigh the community in so many ways. But I was involved in things. The Chamber of Commerce would call on me frequently to work with industry groups, the business community. When I went off and set up my own business about a year later.
That was in 1970.
Right. Mm-hmm. And good judgment would have suggested I go to some place that was more obvious for that type of endeavor, but I wanted to stay here. A year or so later, I got a call from the head of the downtown merchants, and at this point, the mall was created in like 81. This was like 71, and the Downtown Merchants Association called me and said, "We've got a real problem. The Red and Black student newspaper has, for some time, has had this campaign telling students how terrible we are, and that we just are really bad guys. And now there's a summer orientation for incoming students, and it consisted of, at that time, like 10 or 12 2 or 3 day activities. And said the student leaders of this group are telling the incoming students and their parents, if you want to buy anything, buy it in your hometown. It'll be cheaper and you'll be better, and the people here are out to rip you out. And they were very unhappy, and they said, we'd like to do something about this. And somebody at the university has suggested that we get you. And so I made a suggestion. I said, well, you need to have somebody on your program that let you do that, and stand up and tell them that, some of that's true. There are people like that, but it's not totally true. And you want to do right. So they said, well, how about you do it? So I had a good time. I did it for a couple of years with them over here, and I think we changed some minds about that. I will say this, that before my resignation from the university was official and was public, I guess I should say, I'd had the good fortune over years to at least have the opportunity to go a lot of places that are good places. Florida, South Carolina, Kentucky, Wisconsin, California, a number of universities everywhere. Well, I had an opportunity, as I say, toward the end of my time here, but before I made public that I told Dr. Davison over a year before I left I was going to leave. But I had a call one day from Florida State University, and the next day from Duke University. And you mentioned public relations, the term, which is a nasty term now, like publicity used to be the nasty term. It was interesting because the Florida State job was for a vice presidential job. But at that time in 1970, they had a state regulation that they could not classify anybody who had public relations activities as a vice president. But it was on the vice presidential level there, and it included everything. I had tried again in vain to get the university to establish a real strong development program We did not have one. We were probably the last major institution in America that developed a development program, 1973. In 1965, the alumni got Dr. Adderhold to at least bring in 3 consultants to look at this, and they came in and recommended this. They didn't do anything. And finally, in 73, even though Fred Davison had held his feet against it, they finally got somebody to bring in, started the development program. But this was included in the Florida State thing. It was a news operation, the PR operation, the development operation, athletic fundraising, printing part of it, the press. It was and Duke, on the other hand, was offered a similar job there. And Duke, incidentally, and it's a long story to get to this, one of the things that Duke was interested in, and one of the reasons they said they were interested in me, was town and gown relationships. They felt that we had done a good job here. And they had then, and I suspect they still do based on what's happened in the last few years, some very challenging relationships with Durham because of the nature of Duke itself. And they have, the majority of their students are not from the South, and they're in a Southern community, so they had some interest in me. I didn't take either one of those jobs. And sometimes I wonder about that too.
You were talking about fundraising and alumni relations, and an important part of what we do today is our interrelations with development, with alumni relations. Right. What sort of interrelation did you have with those functions back in those days?
With who now?
With development, fundraising.
Okay, well, when I was with the university, there was no formal development program. The only, significant fundraising was done by Tice Butler, who was director of alumni relations. And in those days, the alumni office, which consisted of Tice and a wonderful assistant, and later on, persons like Claude McBride and all came in there. But in those days, it was just Tice, and he had 2 or 3 persons who kept the records. Some of the record keeping was financed by the university, but Tice's immediate operation was funded only by what he could raise. So he had an annual fund campaign every year, and his goal was to raise something like $100,000, which he did. And I always said that probably he had the most successful operation in terms of what it cost to do it and what he resulted in of anybody, But there were people around that raised money for different parts of the university on their own. And I think one of the most significant things was that effort, which was started by the alumni themselves. And I think it actually started in the 30s. My history is not that good. But Hugh Spalding and Robert Troutman, these old-time Atlanta lawyers, I think, who were loyal to the university and had helped support it in different ways, felt that people who wanted to leave money in their states and so forth needed some help. So they set up the University of Georgia Foundation, and the foundation was there. And persons like Bill Hartman, who died a couple years ago, one of the most remarkable individuals I've ever known, loyally just did their own thing for the university. And in the late 50s, early 60s when I was here, I just said, we were way behind. I could not get the university to even take part in any training for this, and on my own, I paid my own way to go to some seminars on estates and trust and tried to come back with that information. To tell you how poor the university was, in 61 or 2, after the integration, I was invited, among other places, to be on a program for a national meeting to discuss this type of thing. and it was going to be held at the Greenbrier. And I put in a request for travel to go to the Greenbrier. It was turned down. And I said, I'm supposed to be on the program representing University of Georgia. Well, we will not approve going to any resort. I said, this is a national body, educational body doing this. I paid to go represent the university on that trip. So I made all kind of efforts, and one of the last things I did as a university employee was what I considered to be a academic formal proposal for development. And part of that came out of the study in 1965 by 3 persons that came here and really did a great job, one of whom later became president of the University of Tennessee, one who headed up the Ford Foundation later. They were University of Illinois, Indiana, Tennessee people who came in and looked at it. They made recommendations which were never followed. And so we did raise that. And I guess one of the projects that I am more proud of is that in the early 60s when Tyus Butler was trying to raise money, and he also was trying to get more alumni to participate. And it had just stabilized at, I don't remember the number, something like 10,000 persons and like $100,000. And Lamar Dodd had come up with some paintings of what was then called Band Day. And Band Day was an activity usually on the football weekend that drew the smallest crowds. And they were invited any band in the high school band in the state wanted to come, and they filled up the north side of the stadium and did this. It was a really colorful, beautiful thing. And he did paintings, and I'd seen those, and I suggested to Tyus, why don't you reproduce one of those paintings and give it to all the alumni who contribute? And that was not an original idea, because the firm I was with in packaging, we had a national competition for art like that. But we went to the head of the Alumni Society, Philip Alston, who was an attorney in Atlanta and later was the ambassador to Australia, and said to him, what do you think about this? And I said, there's a guy with Pepsi Cola who is one of Lamar Dodd's big backers. Maybe you could get them to do it. And this guy says, if it's good, we ought to do it. I couldn't believe he said that. So we did that. And we produced that painting. It's the first time I think it had ever been done, certainly here. And it got enormous response. They got more money they'd ever had received before. They got more persons participating than ever before. And I think that the Development Office and others have done that same thing since then over years. But that was it was a most successful enterprise there in development. But no, as far as getting anything, no, that was I'm sure I was not the only one, but my efforts did not prevail.
Well, you set the university on its way to 5 consecutive years of $100 million in fundraising. We had to have a foundation.
Well, I'm amazed at what can be done, and I think it's great that it's being done.
You mentioned Band Day. Yes. I recall that for many years you were the public address announcer in Sanford Stadium for football games.
Right.
You remember those days? What were those like?
I do indeed remember those.
You'd start out by saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the classic city of the South, Athens, Georgia, and the beautiful campus of the University of Georgia." You had this long and same thing every
Nobody
week.
paid attention to it.
But I did.
In terms of town-gown relations, I felt it was important to tie the university, and this community, and the athletic program, all three together. Dan McGill, the great Dan McGill, called me before I even had the job over here and said they needed somebody to do that, somebody who'd been doing it. And I said, yeah, I'd love to do that. So when I came over in my job, they said, well, Bill, one of your responsibilities is going to be help usher folks in and out of the president's box at games. And I said, I'm supposed to do that thing on the other side of the stadium. and probably did not help my career, but I chose to do the PA and do that other stuff. And
I did that same thing 30 years later.
So I did it, and I did it until late 70s, and I had a good time doing it. It was fun. I worked with the band, and I did the band, and that's another thing. I was impressed with the band when I came back here, and they had a young guy named Roger Dance and his wife who were working with it on a temporary basis because the band director had gone to North Carolina for some program. And I was so impressed with that, what they were doing. They just had a lot of spirit and a lot of color. And I went to Dr. Adderhold and I said, you ought to keep this guy. And I'm sure other people did too. He didn't operate on my name word alone, but they did keep him, and he did a great job with the music program. And in the 50s, television was not quite as extensive. And in the South, the only professional football game that came down was the Washington Redskins on Sunday. It was a very big thing. And at least once a year, they had a state day. And they invited some band from a state and the officials of the state to come and be on halftime and everything. And I said, why don't we do this? So without going into all the details, I got that lined up for us to go and do that. The only problem was that I got it done because I had worked. I got Lockheed to support the first state science fair we had over here. Dr. Adderhold had called everybody together and said, we really ought to have this. We don't have any money. We need to have some money. So I called a friend with Lockheed and said, can you put up $10,000? And he did. And the state science fair became a big thing. By the same token, I'd called a guy who headed up the Division of Tourism and Trade for Georgia and told him we got a chance to go to Washington, D.C. And the Redskins are going to put up $5,000, but we need money for the train trip and for the hotels and all this. Don't worry about it, Bill. We can get this. I'll take care of it. Don't you worry about it. So innocently, I signed the contract for all of this. And as the train pulled out of Athens, Georgia, with everybody on it, this guy says, I need to talk to you. And I said, oh. He said, have you been reading in the paper where the Atlanta papers have been giving us a hard time for sending Miss Georgia to the conventions in Toronto and everywhere? I said, yeah, terrible. He said, we're not going to be able to give you any money for this. Now, raising money before an event is hard enough, but raising it after an event is darn near impossible. I spent almost 7 or 8 months with the railroad company and everybody else coming in saying, Bill, when are you going to pay for all of this? And finally, we had concerts, we did everything. And finally, the dean of students, I went to him and he says, well, it's the end of the year, let's see what's left over. It was a good one.
Oh my goodness.
But it was fun. And I enjoyed doing the public address. My wife asked me from time to time if I missed doing sports broadcasting and things. And I don't really miss it, but I never had any more fun doing anything than doing all of that. That's so much fun. You get paid for doing what other people are paying for. It's great fun.
Anybody who's lived in Athens the past 30 or 40 years has had a chance to hear Bill Simpson be an after-dinner speaker. And they have split their sides with some of your introductory jokes. Now, the jokes often ran longer than the remarks because they were all part of the setup. But then you'd get to the remarks and you'd make your point. Have you got a joke you want to share with us from one of those speeches that you could come up with on the spur of the moment?
No, I think Athens has suffered enough, and the state and the nation. I had a good time doing all of that. I made a talk one time. I was on a program in Louisville, Kentucky, after I left the university, but I was invited to a number of educational things because I was, if you stay around long enough and you do things, you get well known. And I was pretty well known in certainly college public relations development, alumni areas, and was on the national boards and things like this. So for a number of years, I was invited to do this. I really thought I'd make some professional inroads in that area, but I followed the siren songs to go in other directions. But I was in Louisville, Kentucky one time, and was on a program with one of Claude McBride's classmates and friends, Grady Nutt. Grady Nutt was an ordained minister who was a fellow classmate of the legendary Claude McBride and local preacher John Appleton. And the day I left up there, we were on the same program, but he lived there. And the next morning when I was flying out of Louisville, we were on the same plane, and he told me, he said, Bill, he says, I've done something this year, it's the best thing I've ever done, but it was the hardest thing to do. He said, I've hired a business manager, and he says, I'm paying him more than I ever made myself, but it's also paid off for me. And he says, people used to call me and they'd say, will you come make a talk for this thing? And he'd say, oh, well, let me see. Yeah, I guess I can. How much can you pay? A little bit. He said, now, and I wasn't doing anything. He says, I got a manager now, and he says, if somebody calls, I say, talk to my manager. And the manager says, yeah, he's available then for X thousands of dollars. And he says, I'm suddenly making. I never had a business manager, but I had a good time, and I hope that maybe some groups got something out of it.
Well, you turned to this. I know one group that got something out of it was a Sunday school class that you taught many years at Athens First Methodist Church.
One of the great experiences of my life.
Tell me about how you came to be a Sunday school teacher. What was your calling to do that?
Well, at one time I had worked with a high school group in a church, and I didn't. There's nothing that was very significant, I think, other than the fact I enjoyed the young people. But and later on, I was asked to teach a young adult class, and in tandem with another person. And it only took me a very short while to realize that everybody in that class knew more than I did. That could be true in any crowd, but certainly there. But and I didn't do that. And later on, when our youngest son was in high school, I said, I want to go to the church. I want to work with the young people. And he said, I'll quit going to church if you do. But I said, I'm going to anyhow. And I went down, and the church staff was smart enough. They said, Bill, that's not the place for you. We want to start a new class, and we'd like for you to do it. And so that's how I ended up doing that. And I was determined to do that, Tom, for a pretty fundamental reason. I wanted to learn more myself, and I felt that the discipline of trying to lead a class was a way to do that. One of the richest experiences of my life. A great group, particularly because your wife was in it.
We were all charmed by that.
But it was a wonderful experience. And
you did that for many years.
About 18 years, yeah. I think, from the time. I was very frustrated the first year by that, because I felt it was I who was causing the slow progression, but eventually some of you good people took over and made it work.
There may have been something I've left out. Is there something you wanted to talk about that I didn't bring up?
I don't remember anything else except your notes earlier talked about campus personalities, and we had a world of those personalities, I think.
Who do you recall?
Well, Dean Tate is one that comes to mind, and Dean Drury was a legendary figure in terms of those of us who studied journalism. I think the progression of being a student is exemplified to me. I remember as a freshman, one of the requirements, the list of requirements in those days, and we did have Saturday classes, which I think might be a really good idea. But just as I agree with Senator Nunn, I think that universal service is an extraordinary thing for our country's welfare. I wish we had that. I value my Army service extraordinary. But I had a teacher in political science as a freshman, and I thought this has got to be one of the dullest classes in the world. In my last quarter, we had quarters then, my last quarter as a student, I had the opportunity to, have some electives at that time, and I chose a course on international relations, which was a graduate course. And it was taught by the same professor I had as a freshman. And only about 12 or 13 of us in the class. Might be the best class I ever had. certainly was required probably more work than any class I ever had. And I thought it was great. And I thought, this guy's fantastic. Here's one I thought was really not much. And it depends on the circumstances how you react to these people. My favorite story, it's almost a Claude McBride story about the teachers, and they've got to be some now that I just don't hear about these things. But, there was a legendary teacher at Georgia named Pope Brock. Pope Hill. Pope Brock was a lawyer in Atlanta, that's right, Pope Hill. And the legendary story about this guy was that he was teaching his class one time. And well, first of all, they used to say that he would throw a chalk out the window, and he was on the third floor of old academic building. He'd throw the chalk out the window, and he'd say the law of averages says that one day it's going to rise instead of go down. And one day a football player caught it and threw it back up, and he said almost fainted. But his best story was the story when he would give the class, said he described a box, the length of the box, open on each end, closed but open on each end. And he said he puts a mouse in at one end, and the mouse runs at a speed he gives him to the other end and sticks his head out. Turns around, doubles his speed, sticks his head out the other end. Turns around, doubles his speed, continues to do this. And the pose was, how long before the mouse would be sticking his head out both ends at the same time? I've loved that story. It almost goes back to Josiah Meigs, the first real active president of the university, who was of a very scientific bent for those days. And I think there's a letter in the library from Thomas Jefferson to Josiah Meigs in which Jefferson points out that the future of science lay in the South because the northern institutions were so clerically involved, and it's almost the bent we hear today, some of this. But Josiah Meigs, did all kind of things mathematically, and one of them, using the law of falling bodies, determined how far it was the angels fell in their 9 days of descent into hell, millions some odd miles he figured up. And, one thing you didn't mention, and I do think is important for the 50s, 60s, is that with all the problems and all the challenges, it was a period of even considering the growth since then and this enormous growth and development on the campus in the last 20 years or so. But the period in the 50s and late 50s and 60s was a fantastic growth period. The buildings that were built in that time frame, the Science Center, the Georgia Center, the Coliseum, 6 new dormitories followed by other dormitories, the high-rise dormitories, and on and on and on. It equaled the 1930s, and this to me was sort of coincidental that in the 1930s, when the New Deal came along, then Governor Eugene Talmadge was opposed to the New Deal and did not want to accept any of the federal money. Does that sound familiar? Didn't want to accept it, but he finally agreed to it. And during that time frame, the university had its biggest growth in history with buildings that were built during the 1930s here. All kind of buildings were built in the 1930s, including the CJ building and the Commerce Journalism building, it was called then, and on and on. It was remarkable. So there are a lot of good things that came out of the era, and I'm proud to have been a part of, even a modest part of some of that happened.
The one story you didn't share, there was a rumor that you were in the Ugly Man on Campus contest.
Yes, I'm sorry you mentioned that,
but
because
you came in as runner-up.
That's a disappointment. One of the disappointments of my life is that, and it's just campus politics. I should have won it hands down, or face down, whichever you prefer.
Let me say, Bill, you overcame that
and
went on to a lot of contributions to the University of Georgia that have built a foundation for many of us who have followed in your footsteps. And
well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it very much.
Thank you, sir.